And all right. All right. So welcome again to Tina Beaird of Tamarack Genealogy. And here she is with our back to school. So excited about that. Okay.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much,
Tina, for
Anne.
being here.
Thank you, everybody, for being on with us tonight. As Anne said, I am Tina Beaird. I'm the owner of Tamarack Genealogy. I also
You're breaking up just a little bit.
What was that? I also am a colleague of Anne's. I am the genealogy and local history librarian at the Plainfield Public Library. So a little bit further south than you. I am also on the board of the Illinois State Genealogical Society. So I'm going to put in a 30-second plug that the ISGS Fall Virtual Conference is registration is open now. So if any of you are interested in learning more about your Illinois ancestry, hopefully you'll check out the ISGS website, which is ilgensoc.org for Illinois Genealogical Society.org. And hopefully you will join us for the conference next month, which runs from October 16th until October 29th. So I'm going to turn off my camera because I want you to be able to see all of the images and things that I'm going to show on my screen, and I will turn it back on when I am all finished. But please feel free to ask questions if you have them or to put them in the chat, and then we'll go through those at the end of the presentation. So what we're going to talk about today are school records, and that isn't just the type of records that are created directly by the school or by the student, but it's going to encompass a wide variety of things as well as community records, as county records, as state records that all play a part in telling that school story, whether you're the student, the teacher, the administrator, or just staff that works in the school. So there's lots of layers to this. So what types of records are we talking about? So we're going to be talking about things like your typical graduation announcements that you'd see in the newspaper, or a diploma, or coursework or tests or papers that the individual might have kept. But then it's also going to be things that you might not have thought to look for. So it's going to be things like actual report cards or transcripts if they attended a university. Things like class photos, not your typical all students in a row standing on risers, but those individual snapshots and candids of classes as well, if you're lucky enough to find some of those. Things like awards beyond valedictorian, salutatorian, things like track stars or debate club, presidential awards, things like that. Alumni directories are a great resource too, because you don't need to know the exact year that somebody might have graduated. But if you can look through a directory, you can typically figure out through either the alphabetical list of names or the chronological list of students when somebody may have graduated. So there's lots of different types of records that are useful to you. A lot of these are on the personal level, things like those autograph books. I give you an example of a couple of those right here where, people would write personal little notes. These are kind of the precursors to signing yearbooks. And I'll go into yearbooks in more detail, but keep in mind when you're looking for yearbooks, that yearbooks is more of a modern term. Historically, they were referred to as annuals. So if you're looking online through databases, and I'll give you some examples of those at the end, you want to use yearbooks as your main starting point, but then you also want to revert back and look for annuals as well. You're going to find some things that pop up that way. Where am I going to go? When you're doing this type of research, like with a lot of genealogy, think of it as a dartboard or an onion. You're peeling off layers, or you're expanding through concentric circles. So the individual would be the center of the dartboard. And then the school would be the next ring, and then the school district, and then the regional board of education, and then potentially the county or township office, then potentially your public library or local community college, historical societies and libraries, archives. Then you're expanding onto the state level, or maybe newspapers or online sources, which are typically national or international. So you're working your way out and hitting all of these different layers of resources, because each one is going to have a different piece of that puzzle that's going to tell a more thorough history or story of your family or the school in general. So how do I even know? Where would I even go to find out if a school existed, or when the school was established, or who might have been responsible for those records? believe it or not, county histories are a really good resource, especially when you're dealing with early 19th century, 18th century records, because your county history is typically going to talk about the firsts, the first school, the first livery, the first church, whatever it happens to be. And here's an example of that. So in the history of Will County, August Maui talks about the first school in this particular page is referring to Homer Glen. And it tells me that the first school was established and taught by D.C. Baldwin, that he was originally a veteran hardware merchant, but that he taught school originally in the winter of 1834 to 35. Tells me where the school is, that it was on section 19. Tells me it's in a little log shanty with a stick chimney. So gives me a lot of really good information about where that first original school might have been. I'm going to talk in a little more detail when I get to school schedules and school censuses about the establishment of the school system in Illinois. This predates that by a decade. So in Homer Glen, in Homer Township, they were starting schools as early as the 1830s, but typically in Illinois, that wasn't required until 1848. So if you're lucky enough that you can find reference to an early school, you can then start following those layers out to figure out, well, we know it was in section 19. So I'm going to look for a map from that era to see if I can spot the school. I know who the name of the first teacher was, so I'm going to look for information on that particular person. I'm going to look to see if there was any paperwork that was filed, incorporation papers that might have been filed with the county. So for example, if you're establishing a school or a cemetery or a church, you would file papers of incorporation with the local district, the local road district, township, or county, depending on where you live. So I might go to the county to look for a record of the beginning of the school. So city directories, county histories are a great place to find that kind of very basic rudimentary information. Now, it becomes a lot more difficult when you're talking about big cities, where there might be dozens of different schools that could be a challenge to search. So while I don't go into exact detail about city directories in the presentation, they're really, really vital to your research, as well as things like phone books, because a city directory pertinent to the time. So if I'm looking for grade schools from 1950, looking at a city directory from 2011 or from 1899 isn't going to do me any good. You need to make sure you're looking at records that are community records that are pertinent to the time period you're researching. So if I'm looking for schools in Homer between 1835 and 1850, this is a good relevant reference. If I'm looking for schools in Plainfield and I'm looking for 1937, then I'm going to be looking for resources like phone books, which we do have at the Plainfield Library, or city directories that are going to tell me the names of the school and give me their location. So those two resources are really good for figuring out where do I even start. And then from there, I'm going to start looking for the actual records. So things like graduation programs, a lot of historical societies, libraries, museums will have this type of ephemera. And basically what these are things that have been donated by either descendants of or the original people who are listed in these records. But what's great about these is they don't represent one individual person or one individual family. They're really telling a community history. They're definitely what we would reference as public history. And what that means is genealogy is the study of an individual family. So if I'm looking for George Middleton and his family, I'm doing genealogy. But if I want to know more about, potentially the members of the Fourth Baptist Church on the south side of Chicago, that becomes more of a community history. That becomes more of public history because there's many families involved. So while you might not have these records for your family any longer, you can always rely on things like historical societies, genealogical societies, libraries, archives that might have these because somebody else donated them on behalf of their family. So this one, for example, the commencement exercises class day, it's going to give me the inventory of the students who were graduating that day. But there's so much more in these little booklets. Usually the junior class is the one that's sponsoring the graduation for the senior class. So usually they'll have the names of the juniors or younger students who are helping out with graduation. You'll get the names of the people who are performing in the band or who might be singing a song or somebody who might be reading a composition. Those names are going to be included. You're going to get the names of the community that are involved. whether it's the superintendent of the schools, or maybe the president of the council, or whatever the organization is that's overseeing the school. Their names are going to be listed in there. Sponsors, if somebody's sponsoring food or sponsoring the event, those names could potentially be in here as well. So you have to think wider. You have to think broader than just, I'm looking for my dad listed in the DePaul graduating class of 1965. You have to really think of how could he be mentioned in these other records as a student or as a member of the community. I had mentioned class photos. If you're lucky enough that somebody had kept candids and potentially donated them to your local historical society library, definitely reach out and ask. Typically what I'll do with class photos is, if I'm trying to locate somebody who I'm intimately familiar with, a family member, an ancestor that I've done a lot of research on, a community member that I've worked with, so I'm very familiar with their history and their background, I'll go to the organization and I'll say, do you have anything on the class of 1923? Yes, we do. Here's the folder. Here are the pictures that we have. But then I'll also typically ask them, what about your unidentified photos? And a lot of times they look at me and, they're a little taken aback. Well, if we don't know who they are, how are you going to know who they are? And honest to goodness, it really just takes one key to unlock that lock that's on that photo. If you can recognize your ancestor in a photo, you recognize Uncle Bob, you recognize Mom or Aunt Judy, then that opens that up to, well, this is potentially this class because this is my relative. And then you can start looking through other photos and finding similarities and matching them together to say, this is this person, this is that person. And if they have a roster that gives the names of the students from that particular class, then it makes it that much easier. But not just class photos. Think about school photos in general. Think about things like powder puff games and homecoming parades and, Sadie Hawkins dances, where you might just have candid photos where the people aren't necessarily identified. Go through those also and just see if you can spot your family listed in these, in the background or the subject of a particular photo. They're not always easy to find. Again, you have to do a little bit of digging. Sometimes you can find these online through class reunion sites. Don't automatically assume if it's not on Classmates or it's not on Ancestry that it doesn't exist out there. At the back of your handout, there's a list of resources that you can check. But a lot of organizations, a lot of schools have all class reunions. So for example, my class reunion is this year. I will not be attending, but my class reunion is this year. And they're already sending out messages about, hey, come to this event, send us your photos, tell us your stories. And some places do that on a whole class or a whole school scenario. So contact the school or look for that online. Just put in something like all class reunion or class reunion in the name of the school and see what pops up. There's lots of Facebook pages out there. There's lots of Instagram sites out there where you can connect and share these photos, share these stories, or just search them for information about your individual family members. So don't forget the usefulness of social media, but don't think that that's the only solution, that there's nothing else out there available for you. Contact the local organizations wherever you're researching. So you might not live in the community where your parents or your grandparents graduated. Contact those communities and use those resources. Here's an example of one of those. This is the Joliet Township High School class of 1914. This is an enormous poster. It's probably 36 by 30, and it's probably 2 by 3 inch photos of every single one of its students. There is a yearbook that goes along with the 1914 class from Joliet Township High School as well. So even though these students are not identified in this jumbo poster, I'm lucky enough in the fact that there's a 1914 yearbook. So I can pull out the yearbook from the Joliet Public Library or the Joliet Area History Museum, and I can look through it and match up the photos in the yearbook with the photos that are here in the poster so that each and every person in this image can be named and identified. Sometimes you don't have that luxury and you have to do it by ear. Here's another example. This is one that we had in the collection of the Plainfield Historical Society. I was until recently on the board, until my tenure was up. And this photo was donated by a descendant. You could see that it was provided by Lois Vincent Heap. In this photo, she named all of her classmates. So I kind of highlighted two of them just as an example. We're going to come back to this in just a second. In the mail, about 3 weeks before I left the Historical Society board, somebody had just put 4 of those 3 by 5 inch photo postcards in the mail and sent them to us. No information attached to them. Just, I bought these at an estate sale. Here you go. No class year listed, no names on the back of any of them. There were no identifying features in any of these photos. And I'm flipping through them, and they're elementary school photos of children. No idea when, not even knowing necessarily if they're Plainfield. But as I'm going through these photos, I come across one photo, and the little boy in the front, I stopped as I was flipping through it, and I said, I know that face. And that's all it took for me to unlock this photo, to give it a year and to identify a decent number of the children in the photo. So that little boy that I highlighted in the front is the same young man in the back left corner. So I was able to look at this photo. I was able to then confirm that this is Ray Wurst, that these are class photos of Ray Wurst's class. This is the class of 1924. Cecil Lockwood is also in that photo. I could spot Cecil Lockwood as a young child because I have photos from his daughter, who I'm a very good friend with. So I had other pictures to use to distinguish other children in this photo until we were able to be certain that we were looking at the kids who eventually would become the class of 1924. So sometimes it just takes one. We had another stack of photos that were sent to us of a series of 1940s elementary school kids. And one of my volunteers at the museum was like, that's my dad, and went through the rest of the stack of photos and found her dad in all 7 photos. So we were able to confirm this is the class of 1948. Here is Ronnie George. And then we worked our way through. So sometimes, like I said, it just takes one. Always ask. What happens if you don't know? What happens if the problem is sometimes you don't know what you don't know? So you might be able to pick out your father in a photo, or your mom or your aunt or your cousins, or even yourself in a photo. But if you don't know where to look, or you don't know who to ask, then the process is stalled. This particular set of photos, when Will County consolidated school districts into the modern day school system, District 202, District 308, District 204, they shut down all of the individual one-room schoolhouses in the area and consolidated them into school districts. The Will County Regional Board of Education went around and photographed each one-room school and took a photo of the class from that school the year that they were closing the school. So this is the very last class from the Harrington School in Homer Township. This is taken in, the 1947-1948 school year. There are still leaves on the trees, so I'm assuming it's fall and not spring. But this is the last class of Harrington School. So while none of the children are named in these particular photos, I can go and look at those other resources. I can contact the library. I can contact the Historical Society and see if they have a class roster, and then go from there. The beauty is the Regional Board of Education made these available on CD-ROMs. So if anybody has family who was in Will County in the late 1940s, you can contact the Regional Board of Education and ask them for a copy of this disc. I cannot confirm whether or not other school districts did this same process, but it's worth reaching out to the Board of Education or the school district to see if they do have these photos and if they exist. If not, I'd definitely be contacting the county or contacting the local organizations to see if they have them. But what a wonderful resource. I have some for Troy Township schools as well, because I have the disc for Will County. And one of the patrons at my library was like, that's my husband's class. And she was able to name her husband and a lot of his schoolmates just by the photo I posted on the library's social media. So sometimes you can get a lot of answers just by crowdsourcing and sharing a photo like this. So let's advance this a little further from individual school photos or individual class photos up to high school yearbooks. So yearbooks have been around since the 1890s. You can find them in some communities all the way back to that time period. So it's not necessarily a 20th century or a modern phenomenon. Yearbooks are readily available. Like I said, historically, they were called annuals. So if you're getting back early and you're not finding yearbook listed as a term anymore, look for annual. So this is my mom, graduated from Kelly High School class of 1965. So she's in the third row on the left in her black sweater. And I was able to say to my mom, look, Mom, I found a picture of you from high school. And I showed her, this is from ancestry.com. And I turned my laptop around and I showed it to her. And she was like, I am way too young for my pictures to be available online. And I kind of chuckled. This was several years ago. And I said, Mom, you're 72. And she paused and kind of threw her head back and was like, oh, yeah, I guess I am. And I said, Mom, don't be offended. My high school yearbooks are online as well, which they are. So you can find a wide range of yearbooks available, whether it's high school or college available. I give you some sites listed here. Don't take this as being the only sites that might be out there. For example, my high school where I graduated has its own site where the yearbooks are available. So I can look at the yearbooks for my school, and that's outside of these particular sites that are listed here. But high school yearbooks are more than just high school. Sometimes they'll include a lot of information about the local community. Sometimes they'll include information on younger or older classes. I'm going to show you an example of some of those in just a second. Some of them will have those previous classes. They'll have that alumni directory already built into them. So you can flip through the back of the yearbook and see previous classes being listed. Local businesses. So if, mom and dad owned a local drugstore and they ran a congratulations class of 1952 in the yearbook, sometimes there's interior photos of those businesses as well. I'll show you some of those. I'll show you some of my favorites. So the one on the left is Plainfield High School yearbook from 1952. Plainfield began yearbooks in 1949, and we have a full run of them at the library up to 2017. But when Plainfield High School put their yearbook together, they didn't just put grades 9 through 12. They didn't just put freshmen through seniors. It's the Plainfield school system. So Plainfield consolidated in 1948, just like everybody else did. And starting in 1949, I have photos of every student from first grade to 12th grade. Now, Plainfield did not start a kindergarten class until 1953. So that's the first year kindergartners are going to show up. But from 1949 all the way up to 1973, when they separated and started doing a yearbook for the younger kids and a yearbook for the high school, I can follow an entire school career of a student. And they're all listed under Plainfield High School. So don't just assume that this is only going to be 9th grade through 12th grade. Look at them anyway. Whatever yearbook is available in your community, look at it, because you might find some absolute gems like what we've got here. Same thing with Joliet. Joliet Township High School. I showed you the class of 1914. Well, this is from the high school yearbook from 1971. The Joliet Township High School also included 2 years worth of Joliet Junior College students as well. So if those Joliet Junior College students decided to have a yearbook photo taken, then those photos appeared in the Joliet Township High School yearbook. So we can see this woman in the second row on the right is definitely a senior, but she's not a high school senior. So sometimes you're going to find some fun and useful things. Don't think, oh, my family wouldn't be listed in this yearbook from 1967. They all graduated in 1953. They could be a teacher. They could be a janitor. They could be an administrator. They could be going back to school and getting a degree of some kind. So there's lots of reasons why somebody would appear. Don't just think that it's the students. Some of those other things, like I said, a lot of times they would have interior photos of local businesses, usually staged photos. Don't these kids look super happy to be pretending to drink sodas from this local soda fountain? But they'll have the name of the business, the names of the owners typically, and the names of the students who are in the photo. A lot of yearbooks would have information about their men and women who are serving. So whether that's the First World War, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, they're going to be proud to display photos of their service men and women. This is no exception. So this one is from the Turner High School yearbook in Kansas City, Kansas in 1946. So Kansas straddles both Missouri and Kansas. This school happens to be on the Kansas side of Kansas City. But what I absolutely love about this information is, one, William Eugene Copenhaver doesn't look like he graduated the year before. He looks like he's 35. But it tells me all about his service, tells me when he entered the Army, tells me he's finished basic training at Camp Walters, tells me he's serving now with the Occupation Army in Germany. Lots of information I can then take to go look for other records. But James Hugh Craig's, this one, God love him. So this one tells me a ton of information. So he graduated class of 1940, tells me, what rank he is in the service, that he's in the Navy, that he was stationed overseas and then wound up in the hospital. He's now in Jacksonville, Florida. The problem is, James Hugh Craig was never a graduate of Turner High School. His sister, Lorraine, was in the graduating class of 1946, so she included her brother's information, even though he went to a high school across town. So sometimes you really get lucky and find a fantastic piece of information that leads you to all kinds of additional records, just because his sister happened to be in this graduating class. So didn't even go to that school, but still shows up in that yearbook. In memoriams, you'll have students or teachers or other staff, faculty that might pass away during the calendar year or potentially in between over the summer. This is an example. This one is also from Joliet Township High School. This one's from 1910, and it gives a nice little summary of Samuel Marion Meacham's life, a little bit about where he grew up and what he was doing up until the time he passed away as a sophomore. So now let's cast our net a little wider. So we're going to talk about teachers' registers, which are going to mention students. But then a lot of these other resources are going to be those community records, those tax assessments that are going to list a school district, the school schedules, which I'm going to talk about in more detail, annual reports that the district is responsible for filing. This one is a teacher's contract for Janet Brown. This one's from 1946. And in 1946, she was contracted by the school district at a total of $185 per month for the duration of the school year. So now school schedules are something you might not be particularly familiar with, but school schedules were required in a lot of states by law to be done every year to record the students who were eligible to attend classes who were deemed to be of quote unquote school aged. Now, school age could be anywhere from 5 to 21 because the law to be legally considered an adult was 21 for men, 18 for women. So you'll find people, even though they have completed school, they're still considered to be of school age and still show up on these school schedules. I even have one where I have mother and daughter. His daughter is 5 and mother is 20, listed as her husband is listed as head of household for both her and her daughter. So you'll get a lot of great information. It's a good place to find a roster of siblings. It's a good place to find parents who remarry. So if a mother remarries and takes her new husband's surname, that sometimes can be hard to track what happens to the children. So the head of household would be designated and then the children would be listed underneath who might not have the same name. It's also a great way when you're predating vital records. So I'm going to give you an example here. In Illinois, 1847, the law is passed saying that school districts need to be established a minimum of 2 miles apart, beginning in 1848. So the earliest school schedules you will find in Springfield typically date to 1848. Illinois did not request births and deaths to be recorded until November 1st of 1877. They weren't mandatory, meaning you weren't required by law to file a birth or a death certificate until 1914. So from 1848 to 1877, these records might be the only proof that you have that a child existed if the child never shows up on a census because they might have passed away before the next federal census was conducted. They're not always easy to find. You probably have to check every one of those layers that I mentioned. I'll show you some examples in a little bit for Illinois through the Illinois Regional Archives. But sometimes they're on the county level, Sometimes they're at the local historical society. Sometimes they still reside within the school district. You just have to dig and see if you can find them. Now, there is the problem where somebody might claim FERPA. I'll talk about FERPA in just a minute and I'll explain what that is. But here's an example. This one's from Mokina School. This one's from 1847. And this is to set up the eligibility for the school. You needed to have a minimum of 10 students who were of eligible school age to have a viable school district in order to collect taxes in order to establish the school. So look at the ages of these kids. Only 2 of them are actually of the quote unquote legal age. The rest are 4. You've got 4, 6, 4, 6, 4, 4, 10, 4, and 1. And I assure you, that is not 4th grade, 10th grade, or 1st grade. William Saring shows up in the 1850 census as being 4 years old. So they literally needed one more kid dragging, poor William Saring. I can guarantee you he never went to school. But they needed one more eligible child in order to declare that school district viable. Here's a couple more examples for you. This one is from Wheatland Township School District number 40. They have the boys on the left, the girls on the right. It tells me the names of the students and for what date this was recorded. So this was recorded on the 8th day of March in 1909 for the entire month ending on April 7th, 1909. So sometimes you'll find one that's done at the beginning of the school year. Sometimes you'll find ones that are done every single month. You just have to look and see if you can find them. So I can see that, there's lots of Pattersons in here. So I've got James Patterson, I've got Homer Patterson, I've got Myrtle Patterson. We might be able to make the assumption that they're siblings or they might be cousins. Then you would have to do a little bit of digging to figure it out. But it provides me the names. So we have Lydia and Lulu. Kuffner, who are listed here as being 13 and 10. So you have a lot of siblings. You have David Fairweather and his sister Bessie. I do know that they are siblings. But look at poor Bessie. She's 14 years old. She's been in attendance 0 days. Same thing with Edward Brockway, has been in school 0 days that particular month. Could have been illness, could have been any number of things that might have kept her out of class. Here's another example of one. This is for district number 3. This is Frankfort Township. This is 1895. Again, this one is done monthly. This is from February 8th, 1895 until the 12th of March. Boys on the left, again, girls on the right. You can see these are standardized forms that they're filling out, but it's giving me the names of all of the students who are attending this particular school with Belle Conklin as the teacher. Here's a photo that I took. These particular records for Frankfort Township are at the Illinois State Archives in Springfield. It depends on your community where your school records might happen to live. So you're going to have to kind of poke around and ask questions and see who might have them. But you can see in this case how they're arranged, from the earliest records in 1848 all the way up into the 20th century. So I absolutely adore school schedules just because of the types of information that they'll provide. Typically on later school schedules, you'll get exact birth dates for children, which you might not have access to in any other way. For example, I do research in Emporia, Kansas, which is Lyons County. Lyons County Historical Society has their census records that go back into the 1880s. What's fabulous about those is it's the exact date of birth of the child and who their parents are. Kansas and Nebraska didn't start requesting birth and death information until 1910 and 1911. So 25 years prior, just like in Illinois, before the state starts requiring that information, I'm getting exact dates of birth for these children. Teachers' registers, they're exactly how they sound. They're those books, those logs that the teacher would write in every day to keep track of students' attendance, keep track of whether or not they're completing their coursework, and whether or not they're eligible for promotion to the next grade level. Usually in the back of the book, every one-room schoolhouse had a guests page where friends or family might have been in town, or a mother might want to come to school for the day to see what her child is learning, and they would sign the guest book at the back. So it's interesting. Don't just look through the register for your student. Look at the back to see who might have visited. He might have had a cousin from out of town staying with them, and they came to school and they signed the guest book in the back. So it's worth it to go to the end and see what else might be listed there. But it's usually giving you the name of the teacher, it's giving you the name of the superintendent and the information about the board members. Typically, you can find these on those layers that I talked about. So here's a couple of examples. This one's from the Scotch Church School, Wheatland Presbyterian School. This one's from 1922. So it gives me the names of the students, tells me how many days they have attended class and where they are in their coursework. How well are they doing? 5s are excellent, 4s are good, 3s are meh, 2s are, whoa, hold on. We could see poor little Lily Mae Richardson is not doing so good in her weekly summaries. She only has a 1. So you want to take it into account. These are 2 pages. So the first page is going to be students' attendance and where they are in their coursework. The second page is going to be that personal information about the student. I'm going to show you an example of one of those in just a second. But again, you can see all the siblings and cousins. Robert Stewart, Jean Stewart, and Thomas Stewart. Jean and Thomas are siblings. Robert's a cousin. You've got Clarence Wolfe and Louetta Wolfe. Those are brother and sister. So you're going to see a lot of family members, family groups that show up in these records. Here's that second half of the page. This is for a different year. This one is 1924. And you can see very good worker, very neat, very bright, but not as neat about their schoolwork. You know, a good worker, very bright. So these can be a lot of fun. They give you some insight into how they were doing in school. One of my ancestors is listed in one of these registers, and the teacher actually wrote in the margin, you know, she's not very bright. I don't understand why she keeps coming to school every day. I almost fell off my chair laughing because that very next year she drops out of school and gets married and starts raising a family. So maybe she took the teacher's advice, but it was all laid bare in the teacher's register. So now I mentioned FERPA. Let me explain a little bit what FERPA is. So like HIPAA is to medical records, FERPA is to school records. So FERPA is the Federal Education Records Protection Act. And what that means is that these records are sealed for minors under the age of 18 to only the minor or people with authority. So that could be family members, that could be government entities, maybe trying to prove date of birth or age for services or something like that. So in some instances, if you are trying to go to the school district, the school board, the school superintendent, they might tell you these records are not available to you because of FERPA. That is not typically the case if you're contacting a historical society or you're contacting a local museum or library who has these in their possession, because as soon as the school district gives those up and relinquishes them out of their possession, they're no longer under the requirements of FERPA. So the only time you're going to run into FERPA is if they're still held by the district or the teaching board of some kind. So what they might say is, no, we can't give that information to you unless you can prove that person's deceased. Okay, that's fine. Or they might come back and say, we can't give you a copy of these teachers' registers because there are other students listed on them and you can't verify that all of these students are dead. Yes, that is very much the case. But I can guarantee you that if I want to look at a class register from 1877, I'm pretty certain that none of those students are probably still living. So sometimes you have to make a logical argument in order to gain access to these. But if they've already left the hands and they're already in a museum or historical society or library, then you have access to those outside of the requirements of FERPA. But in your handout, I give you the link that explains what FERPA is if you wanted to learn more about that process. So now tax records. So my grandma Nellie, God love her, rest her soul, she always said there's 2 things in life you can never get out of, and that's death and taxes. She's absolutely right. And the beauty of tax records are the fact that they taxed you on, well, tax you on everything, right? It kind of feels that way. But typically you would be taxed on 2 levels. So when you look at tax records, so if you go online and you take a look, like this one's Monee Township, there's 25 years worth of Monee Township tax records online through CARLI, the Consortium of Academic and Research Libraries, through Governor State University. I have digitized and made available Wheatland Township tax records from the 1850s through IDA, Illinois, the Illinois Digital Archive. So they're out there and they're available. Typically, these books were split into 2 parts and they were done annually. The first part would be real estate taxes. So that would be how much do you own on your property? So that's where you're going to find the owner on record, not the renters. but it's still useful because they're arranged by section, township, range. So if you have a renter and you know where they are, you can look for the owner and how much they were paying in taxes. But on the flip side to that, the second half of the book was personal property. They taxed you on whether you had a cart or a wagon. They taxed you on how many sewing machines or how many watches or clocks you might have had. They taxed you if you had a dog. So if you look at this, you could see, the people who were taxed and pay taxes on their dog. But right next to that column, it gives the name or the number of the school district, which is gold, because you could be in section 14 and have absolutely no idea what school district that relates to. And here it's spelling it right out for you, that they're either in district 2, 3, number 1. There's a union school, which is the town school. So this one person sent their kid to the town school while everybody else went to the one-room schools in the different districts. So if you can find your tax records, you should be able to identify pretty quickly what school district they would have paid taxes to. You're not going to send your kid to another district if you're paying taxes to another. So odds are, if it says District 3, that's where you're going to go to look for information on the children of that particular farmer. Sometimes you find some other good things. This is at the State Archives in Springfield. This is the establishment of the school district in DuPage Township in Will County, which is what is now Bolingbrook, Romeoville. So basically they were getting all of the residents together to vote on whether or not they were going to pay a tax to establish a school, have a schoolhouse with a teacher and a library. And 2 people objected. And the 2 people who objected were the 2 wealthiest guys in the community because they didn't want to have to pay their fair share of tax. So the 2 Barber brothers. So if you're familiar with Bolingbrook, the area that's now Bolingbrook was originally called Barber's Corners. John Barber and his brother were the owners of that land, and they were the 2 that voted nay to establishing the school district because they didn't want to have to pay tax. They wanted having to pay tax anyway because the district was passed and established. And Lyman Meacham became the first secretary for the school district. So he kept this lovely book. It's about 38 pages long on the board minutes in that early history of the establishment of that school district. And those are available at the State Archives. I have another one which was established in Wheatland Township. So when they established the Tamarack School, John Brown had donated the land for the school to be established and made an argument in the records that's written that you can find in the Wheatland Township minutes that he shouldn't have to pay tax because he donated the land. Yeah, he had to pay taxes anyway. But all of that shows up in those local community, whether it's the county records or whether it's the township records. So you want to be on the lookout for those if you can find them. Newspapers are huge because they report on everything, especially in a small town. Nothing goes unnoticed. So that could be things like dean's lists. That could be things like football and baseball scores, homecoming events, societies and clubs. All of that stuff is going to show up in the local newspaper. Graduations, class reunions. But in a lot of communities, the individual school had its own newspaper. So whether it was the high school, they had a weekly newspaper that was put out or a monthly newspaper, or the college or university put out its own newspaper. So I went to Illinois State University, go Redbirds. The Vedette was a newspaper that was put out every week for a century. They moved it digitally 2 years ago. So now it's only available as a born digital, as an electronic newspaper, but it's still out there. And they've digitized the back issues of it, and it's fully available and accessible to people to search and look for their family members in it. So sometimes you want to look for these high school or college newspapers too, because they can tell a great story. Here's an example of one. So I love that in Plainfield that there's high school newspapers called the High Times, because if you're a person of a certain age, you know that High Times magazine is a journal about marijuana. So it kind of cracks me up. Don't read anything into that. But in October, as they were gearing up for the homecoming dance and parade, they ran an article about all of the students who had just graduated that previous June, so 4 months earlier. And if you look at this newspaper, look at all of the young ladies that had gotten married between June and October. So Rhonda Countryman is now Mrs. John Weber. Concerto Cucci is now I apologize, is now Mrs. Vincent Manfredini. Ava Glasgow is now Mrs. Courtney Smith. Dorothy Hacker is now Mrs. Walter Newman. In 4 months, 3/4 of the young ladies got married, or the other half went to work, and I get occupations and employers as well listed here. So all of this comes from just one newspaper article that ran in the local high school newspaper. Don't assume that your ancestor graduated from high school. There are numerous reasons why that might not have ever happened. So while it's usually a good rule of thumb, if you know that dad is born in 1920, he would have been the graduating class roughly of 1938. It's great to jump ahead to that point, but if you don't find them, there could be reasons for it. They might not have ever graduated. They could have dropped out to join the service. They could have dropped out to go to work. Dad could have been sick. They needed gainful employment. So there's lots of reasons. They could have graduated early. So you don't always want to just assume they graduated. Sometimes you have to look for the in-between. Things like promotions and graduations, 6th grade, 8th grade graduations. So this is the 8th grade graduating class from Plainfield Junior High. This is June 12th of 1952. About a third of the young men who are listed in this photo in 8th grade did not graduate from high school 4 years later. And the reason being is because it was in the height of the Korean War, and several of them had dropped out and joined the service, all branches of service. So there's a possibility that you're never going to find a high school graduation. Go back and look for some of these other events. Here's one from Atchison High School. This one is from the 1920s, and I have those individual headshots of all of the seniors who were in that graduating class. Fantastic resource. It might be the only photo you ever have. Or you can now reach out to Atchison High School or the Historical Society and say, in this newspaper is this photo. Do you have the original? Can I pay for a copy of it? But like I said, some people never graduated at all. So if you read this article in the bottom corner, Oscar Baker has quit school and will motor to Flint, Michigan with Stanley Heron, who's his best friend, where both boys expect to get positions in the carpentry line. There's no point in looking for a graduation announcement or a photo of him. They didn't graduate. But now I have 3 pieces of information to look for. I'm going to look for him in Flint, Michigan. I'm going to look for Stanley Heron to see if they both stayed there. I'm going to look in the census. I'm going to look in the phone book or the city directory. I'm going to look to see if maybe they had apprenticed or had truly gotten jobs as carpenters. I'm looking for union records and things like that. So that one little blurb tells me a lot. They didn't graduate. They left the state, and here's what their occupation hopes to be. Now, Mae Morrissey, I love this article. It's a full page article, column article. They gave her the entire column. She had gone off to war during the First World War, and she had served 3 years overseas. She had joined when Great Britain declared war and had gone overseas before the US had even declared war, had served with British units as a nurse in the hospital in England, comes home 3 years later. The entire article is talking about how she survived the war and survived the pandemic and everything that went along with it. They did not have a photo of her in her uniform. Unfortunately, the only photo they could get their hands on was her high school graduation photo. So I find out all about her military career, and then I get a photo of her in her high school gown, cap and gown as well. This is my absolute favorite find of all time. In Plainfield, homecoming is enormous. It is the event of the year. As many as 10,000 people will show up for the parade. Homecoming is a very big deal in Plainfield. So the very first homecoming took place in the 1950s, and every year since they honor what they call the 50-year class. So this newspaper article in October of 1960 is honoring the 50-year class, which would have been the class of 1910. Problem was, nobody could get their hands on readily a photo of the graduating class of 1910. The only photo that they could find was their first grade photo. So here is their first grade photo from 1891 of the 1910 graduating class in the newspaper from 1960. And the beauty of this photo is that every single one of those children are named. What's even better is the fact that there were only 11 kids who graduated in the class of 1910. So I have a name of all of the students who would have been their contemporaries even though only a fraction of them actually graduated. And here's that original photo. The original photo exists at the Plainfield Historical Society. So look at those adorable little cherubic faces. And if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the high school classmates kind of looking out the window at what's going on that day. So now where can I go? How am I going to look? I've given you some suggestions already of places where you can look for this information. Definitely go to the Illinois State Archives website. So Jesse White is our Secretary of State, but he is also our state archivist and our state librarian. So he is the person who's responsible for records management for the state of Illinois. So if you go to the state website and you click on departments, it's going to take you to a tab for all of the departments he oversees. And two of them are going to be the Illinois State Archives and the Illinois State Library. If you click on the page for Illinois State Archives, it brings up this screen. And it says, these are all of the different things that you can do at the state archives. You can search their online databases. You can apply for grants. You can do other things. But the Illinois Regional Archives Depository System, what is known as IRAD, is a series of regional archives that are scattered around the state. So not everything is stored in Springfield. So sometimes to save you the trip down to Springfield, you can visit the regional archive that would be dealing with the counties that you're looking for. So for example, here in our area, the records are held at Northern Illinois University. So each of the state schools, Northern, Western, Eastern, ISU, University of Illinois Springfield, Southern Illinois University, and Northeastern Illinois University, each has a regional archives where they house records. So NEIU off of Pulaski and Bryn Mawr at Northeastern University has the records just for Cook County because it is so vast. That does not include the city of Chicago that has its own records. That is Cook County as a whole. Otherwise, you could see all of the different counties that are represented by the other universities. Each one of these is going to have a collection that you can either write to them or you can call them. You cannot email them. They do not have an email address for you to contact them. And that's to cut down on the number of requests, because these are students who man these archives and they're open during school hours. So if the school is closed for winter break or spring break or the summer, you're at the mercy of the university. But typically they'll have mostly microfilm and microfiche records, but occasionally they do have original textual records as well. But they do have a database, and I did put that in your handout. So if you go to the departments, if you go to the IRAD holdings, there's a database that you can search by IRAD system. So I want to see everything that Western Illinois has, or I want to see everything that they have on Piatt County. And you can sort and search in that way, or you can search by keyword. So if I click on the database, I can search by school, military, probate, whatever the search term might happen to be in order to find what I'm looking for. So I just did a search on school. I wasn't specific. I just did a search on school, and it gives me 3 pages worth of records. I just took a screenshot of the top half of one of those pages. That's how vast these records collections are. And you can see the types of things they have. Superintendent annual reports, that would be how much they're paying staff and faculty and janitors and maintenance and all of that. School district records, that's the maintenance, the running of the school district as itself. But look at all of the teachers' registers. Look at all of those school schedules or school censuses that are listed here. So for example, for Hancock County, I can see that they have, teachers' daily registers from 1879 all the way to 1953. That I can see, other collections that go from, 1836 to 1861, 1914 and 1951. So this is a really deep and robust collection that you have access to. So for example, if I wanted to know about the teachers' daily registers for Hancock County, I can see that they're at Western Illinois University, and here's its record collection number. So I could cite that number series at the end. Now here's the thing with IRAD. IRAD will do a search for you at no charge, but they will limit you to 2 names at a time. So you can't say, I want every Smith that's listed in every one of those records. But what you can say is, I'm looking for George and Lucy Smith. in these Hancock County teachers registers, potentially this school or this district from 1875 to 1888, or, 1863 to 1868. And they will look for you, but they will not look just broadly for everything on a particular surname. So that doesn't mean you can't re-request. Start with George and Lucy, and then maybe move along to, Michael and Elizabeth a little later on, and have them do your searches for them. All you have to do is contact them, and their contact information is in that IRAD page that I've provided for you. So some other places where you can go. I had mentioned Classmates already. I'm going to talk a little bit more here about Family Search and Internet Archive, because there's some things you might not be aware of that you can look for through those. MyHeritage has a really strong collection of college yearbooks. So whether you're a Cornhusker or a Jayhawker, they've got those yearbooks already available digitally through their website. But now Family Search, believe it or not, has a lot of records that pertain to individual schools and school records. So while it's great to use the Family Search Wiki to see if there are school records that even exist for that time period that you're searching, there might not have been a district in the area at that time, or the records might be somewhere else. And the Family Search Wiki is going to kind of lead you in the right direction. But you could also just do a general search in the records box on Family Search's page. So I can go into the records and just search for the word school. And it's going to bring up all of the collections that exist out there. So I can see that there's Iowa, that there's Germany, that there's the Czech Republic. Don't just think of this as being a US phenomenon. So I can do those types of searches directly through the website, but then I can dig a little deeper. So just like Algonquin and my library and Fountaindale and numerous other libraries are what are called Family Search affiliate libraries, we can go in and dig through the card catalog. So instead of going to records, I just went to catalog and did a search on school schedules. And you could see 93 different collections of school schedules show up. I have everything from the US to Scotland to Australia. Brazil, I think, is listed in there. And it gives me the collections that I could then go and view. Remember what I said, schedules, censuses, play around with terminology and see what else happens to come up. Another great resource is Internet Archive. Internet Archive has a tremendous number of yearbooks and annuals that are available through their website. So you could go out to the site and you could just do a search on yearbook. Or if you happen to know the name of it, like ILIO for University of Illinois, you can go in and put the name of the yearbook in there specifically, like the Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Nursing Hospital is called the Sprague. I can go in and do a search on the Sprague and it'll bring up those yearbooks for me. You can always browse. So you could go into the American Libraries collection and just browse the yearbooks that are listed in there as well. Again, remember to use the term annual. That's going to come up as well. Here's another one. This is the Alpha yearbook as well. And it gives me the names of all of the young ladies who are attending the nursing school there and their hometowns. So I could look for the individual person, or I could go into Internet Archive and look on the name of a community and find all of the people scattered across the country who show up in yearbooks and county histories and city directories who are referencing back to that hometown. So there's a lot of ways that you can find some really good gems available out there through Internet Archive. I mentioned you could browse. I talked about CARLI a little earlier, the Consortium for Academic and Research Libraries. This is where you can find those tax records for Moni that are at Governor State University. But just looking at CARLI, look at all the yearbooks. There's 455 individual yearbooks that are available through CARLI. Most of them are associated with these schools. So whether it's UIC, whether it's Loyola, whether it's DePaul, whether it's Governor State, and I kind of have an inventory right there on the side to kind of help me dig a little deeper. So there's some great things that show up in Internet Archive that relate to schools and school records as well. So I am going to turn my camera back on. I am perfectly, wonderfully happy to answer whatever questions you might have for me. And you can see that, apparently not much has changed between when I was in second grade and now. But I am happy to answer any questions you have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
No, that's an adorable picture. You got to keep that up.
I still got the same bang.
I love the pigtails. That's awesome. So while people are thinking about a question, I do have a question. So I haven't done a lot of search or requests through IRAD.
Mhm.
Except a long time ago, I think I requested a death record ages ago before things were online so much. But how often could you email the depository for a particular search? I mean,
You
how
want to be
often?
sensitive, right? You don't want to inundate them with
Yeah,
things.
like
But I
every
would say
other week or?
there's nothing wrong with contacting them, giving them the information, but don't contact them with something else until they've responded to your first request. So here are
That
the
makes sense,
records that I found for George and Lucy, then give it a
right,
week and then request again.
right,
So there's no problem with serial requesters. I mean, you and I know we love that.
right.
But you have
Yes.
to give them the opportunity to find your first request
Mhm.
before you start looking for subsequent requests.
Yeah,
So
so
yeah, I would say give
don't
them
avalanche them with requests, just because there's only two names in one email.
yes, and the cost
Right.
is ridiculously cheap.
Uh-huh.
So each IRAD kind of sets their rates. It could be 50 cents per page. It could be $5 for the first 10. Like it's usually
Mhm.
really nominal and
Yeah,
completely doable.
right. Now, those are some really great resources. Let me see, I have a chat question. Any recommendations for Catholic schools?
Absolutely.
Finding
So
information on them.
first, I'm going to say good luck. Actually, some Catholic dioceses and archdioceses are faster to respond. It depends on the size of the organization. So my experiences have been with the Chicago Archdiocese and with the Joliet Diocese. You have to keep in mind that they encompass a huge area. So for example, the Joliet Diocese covers all the way up to West Chicago. I mean, it's a huge range that they're responsible for. So typically, because they are not part of the public school system, they don't have to file things with the state like a public school would have to. So those records typically will stay within the Catholic Church, either through the diocese or the archdiocese. So if a Catholic parish closes or if it merges, I'd be looking to see, did the records when they merged stay with the remaining organization that stayed open? Or did they get turned over to the diocese or the archdiocese? And the same thing is going to be true with other faiths as well. So if a Presbyterian church closes, do those records go to the presbytery? Do they go up to the synod? What happens to them after the district closes? Same thing with Methodists, which synod does it wind up going to? And in Illinois, we're split. Some go to Missouri and some go to Minnesota. So you got to figure out what the organizing body structure is and follow the food chain. So for example, like if I need a record, like my grandma went to St. Jen's on the west side. We grew up in Bridgeport, so we went to Nativity of Our Lord. So, I'm going to contact the archdiocese to ask for copies of those records. I've done that in the past. They've come back with FERPA. I get it. So I've not had any success getting anything out of the Chicago Archdiocese yet.
Yeah,
Even my mom has asked for her records and they haven't provided them. Joliet was a little bit easier to work with because it's a smaller institution without as numerous number of students. So just, it depends on the organization.
right.
I will say, one thing I will say before I move on is if you are dealing with a religious organization, not necessarily a parochial school or a charter or a magnet school,
Mhm.
charter and magnet schools, you can sometimes find those records at the state level and the county level. You just have to dig a little deeper. But if you're contacting a religious organization, send a check. I know that sounds, kind of weird and forward, but
Yeah,
doesn't hurt to say, here's my $25. Can you see if you can find, wink, wink, the records that I'm asking for? And
right.
that sometimes works.
Very cool. So if there was a school, even a Catholic school or other religious school that was still open, would you start there and see if they have yearbooks or photos or maybe somebody in a library in the school?
Absolutely. It
see
depends
what-
on what you're asking. So
Mhm.
if I'm just looking for a class photo, if I'm just looking for a yearbook, absolutely contact the school. But if I'm looking for those personal records, like I'm looking for transcripts or report cards or things that are about the individual student personally, that's when they get a little cagey and they could give you a hard time about providing those records. But if I say, my mom was in the choir or she ran track, can I get a picture of the track team? Usually it's not a huge problem, and I would start with the school.
Right. Okay, that's a good idea. I have another question here. Our guest says, my wife is from Illinois, but I am from Ohio with other ancestors from Pennsylvania and Minnesota. Do you know if similar resources exist for Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota?
I'm not sure. Yes.
I'm gonna duck out for a second because
Okay.
my power's gonna die and I don't have my plug. I'll be right back, but feel free to continue. If you
Hopefully
can
we don't
access the
lose them.
chat, if anybody has questions, hold on, I'll be right back.
Absolutely.
Thanks. Tina.
So in Ohio, the Ohio State Archives runs a website that's called Ohio Connection. I would definitely take a look and see if they have school records listed as part of Ohio Connection. You can easily go out there and take a look. And a lot of times it's really just doing an internet search to see what exists. So start with all of those different layers. If you know where they were, start with the county. Something like Cuyahoga County school records, or, Ashtabula school records, and see what comes up. Same thing with Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania State Historical Society is phenomenal and has amazing records that are available. Same thing with the Athenaeum and the Historical Library in Philadelphia. It depends on where you're doing your research. Same premise. I'm looking for those keywords and those buzzwords. So maybe it's not called the Regional Board of Education. Maybe it's called something else, but it would be that governing body that would be responsible for overseeing the regional school district. Sometimes it's the county, sometimes it's a road district, sometimes, it's called something else. But I would definitely do the same types of searches. And in Family Search, I'm pretty sure that they do have some Minnesota school records already digitized and available online. I know they do for the Dakotas as well, because I had family up in Moorhead, which was Minnesota, right across the border from Fargo. And there are some records that were available that I was able to find for them. So I would absolutely dig through and just see what's available. I'd go to the state archives. I'd look at the county website. I would look at the school. What does the school have? Some schools have history pages. Every school has a contact us page, and ask for that information. Hi, Ann.
Hello.
You got your power cord?
I got it. I'm in. I'm on.
Okay. So I just finished that question. I don't know if there's
Okay.
any other questions out there.
Great. Let's see. Does anyone else have any questions for Tina?
How many of you have found your records online? Like I said, my high school yearbooks are already out there. So I'm grateful in the fact that when my school put my high school yearbooks online, they accidentally reversed them.
Oh,
So that my senior yearbook, the one that's up there, is my freshman yearbooks, and I didn't go to school then. So like nobody will ever find me because the two books are backwards. It's wonderful.
That's fun. Yes, I found mine. I found my mother's, my uncles and aunts, everybody from McHenry high schools. Those are all online on Ancestry. Yeah, there's a bunch that's available on Ancestry. And remember, if you don't have it at home, access to it at home, you can use Ancestry Library Edition at the library. Even, if you're just visiting from another library, you can certainly use our access. So that's a good place to start. But you've given us a lot of really interesting things. I haven't been on Carly. I haven't searched on that for forever. And the www.archive.org is huge. That's another one that I have forgotten about. So a couple weeks ago, well, maybe a month ago by now, I realized that I hadn't searched some resources in a while, and I went back to search them with the same old searches that I was running before, but hadn't in a while. And I had a bonanza day on a Thursday. I found records going back for not school records specifically, but records that were uploaded since the last time I had been there. And I got back another generation on 2 lines. So it's just a good reminder to go back and check these, every so often to.
Oh, yeah. A lot of organizations were
Mhm.
digitizing like mad during COVID
Yes.
and
Mhm.
putting those records up there, Internet Archive being one of the Library of Congress. And remember, Library of Congress is the people's library. So there's a lot of homegrown, personal, local records that are available, like Sanborn maps, and there are school records and stuff in there too. So don't
Mhm.
forget Library of Congress is a resource too. Just think, oh, it's
Yep.
national. That's not us.
Right.
Absolutely, it is us. And they went nuts during COVID and put
Mhm.
all kinds of fantastic stuff up.
A lot of people were very busy, and I love that. There's so much
Mhm.
I might have to retire to have enough time to do all my research.
I feel the same. Well, I'm very grateful for
So,
all of you spending your time with me. You've got my email address in the handout. So if you start playing around and you're like, oh, one more, send
right?
me an email. I'm perfectly happy to answer it, or ask Ann. Stop in and visit her. I'm sure she'll check too.
Yep, and if I don't have an answer, I have lots of people I can reach out to, including Tina here. You've been great and given us so much really good information. I'm excited to get home and start looking at stuff tonight. Might stay up late tonight, so we'll see how sleepy I am tomorrow, but I really appreciate it. So thank you again, Tina, and thank you all for joining us tonight. You can watch for the video probably in a week or so. It'll be up on our YouTube page if you want to share it with somebody else or just go over it for something you might have missed, but it'll all be there. Okay. Thanks again, everybody. All
Thanks,
right.
everybody. Good
Okay,
night.
bye, Tina. Thank you.